Imagine coming home to find that a train track has been built through the heart of your family's generational farm, a farm that's been in your family for over 80 years. While you were away caring for your sick daughter, heavy machinery tore through your best crops, replacing them with tracks, benches, and decorative lighting, all for a tourist attraction you never agreed to. And when you confront the HOA, they hand you a check that can barely cover the cost of the seeds you planted. But just as you think your fight is over, you discover something shocking. The very office building where the HOA holds its meetings is sitting on your land. What will you do when you realize the very organization trying to force you out is operating on your property? Will you fight back, or will they win? And what happens when your battle turns into something bigger than just land? Stay tuned to find out. Jim Miller stood by his father's old farmhouse, the familiar scent of hay, earth, and freshly turned soil filling the air. He had inherited this small, multi-generational farm from his father, who had inherited it from his father. The farm, nestled at the edge of what was once rural farmland, had been in Jim's family for over 80 years. It was more than just land. It was a legacy, a symbol of hard work, sacrifice, and tradition. Jim's grandfather, a World War II veteran, had returned from the war and purchased this land with the hope of building something meaningful. He built the red barn with his own hands, plowing the fields and cultivating the crops that had supported their family for generations. For Jim and his wife, Carolyn, the farm wasn't just about the crops they grew or the market they sold at. It was about preserving a piece of their family history, a legacy they were proud of. Over the years, Jim had cultivated a deep love for the land. Every sweet corn he grew, every tomato vine he tended, was not just for a paycheck. It was a tribute to his family's resilience. But now, with the neighboring town of Pine Ridge rapidly expanding, suburban homes with perfectly manicured lawns were encroaching on Jim's property. McMansions were popping up where fields once stood, and the peaceful, quiet life Jim had known for decades was slowly being erased by development. When the Pine Ridge HOA came to town, Jim wasn't surprised. He had seen it all coming. But what did surprise him was the way the HOA started to see him as a problem. His farm, a symbol of hard work and family values, was suddenly deemed an eyesore. Suburbanites, who had no idea what it took to run a farm, were now claiming that Jim's tractor was too loud, his vegetable garden was too unkempt, and even his red barn, a family heirloom, was out of place. The complaints kept coming, all designed to pressure Jim into selling the land. But Jim refused. He was stubborn, determined to keep the farm in the family for as long as possible. In his mind, this farm wasn't just about making money. It was about family heritage, and a promise to preserve the land his grandfather had worked so hard to build. He wasn't going to let anyone come in and destroy that, no matter how hard they tried. And try they did. The HOA, led by Lydia Caldwell, an ambitious, corporate-minded woman, began their relentless pursuit of Jim. They wanted progress, and Jim's farm was seen as an obstacle in the way of their suburban utopia. The HOA, with all its power and resources, was going to stop at nothing to get what they wanted. The changes in Pine Ridge were becoming more pronounced. What used to be quiet farmland was now quickly being overtaken by rows of newly built homes. The neighborhood was starting to look like every other suburban sprawl in America. Homes that all looked the same, cookie-cutter houses with no character, no history, no soul. For Jim, the contrast was painful. He would look out at his fields, handed down from generations before him, and see them surrounded by towering subdivisions and strip malls. The land, once full of life and purpose, was now being overtaken by concrete and asphalt. It felt like his whole way of life was being swallowed up by the greed of developers and the short-sighted vision of the HOA. And then came Lydia Caldwell, the new president of the HOA. Lydia wasn't like the previous president, a man who had at least understood the importance of maintaining some semblance of community in the neighborhood. Lydia was corporate through and through. With her perfectly tailored suits and her sleek, polished demeanor, she made it clear she had one goal: to raise property values and make the community look like something out of a magazine. To her, Jim's farm was nothing more than a blemish on her vision of perfection. Lydia had a plan, and Jim was standing in her way. Lydia and her team began bringing in surveyors and contractors, trying to find ways to push Jim out. They offered him money, lowball offers, of course, far less than what the farm was truly worth. But Jim refused every time. Every time they came at him with brochures for retirement communities or commercial development, Jim turned them down. This farm wasn't just about money. It was his home and his family's history. He couldn't be bought. But the pressure was mounting. Lydia had a slick way of manipulating the situation. She would meet with Jim, pretending to be cordial, offering suggestions for how he could improve his farm to meet HOA standards, while all the time looking for a way to take his land. She would bring Richard Thompson, a retired lawyer, to work the legal side of things, sending him with documents and proposals that would have, in their eyes, made Jim's land seem obsolete. It was a war of attrition. They didn't care about his family's legacy. They cared about property values. Lydia's aggressive approach began to escalate. As the HOA president, she wasn't just trying to get Jim to sell his land. She was trying to make his life unbearable. She had hired lawyers, surveyors, and even started building plans that included rerouting the main road directly through Jim's land, essentially cutting him off from access to his farm. She would stop by and casually mention that the county was planning to widen the road for a new shopping complex, which would require taking a portion of his land. But Jim didn't fall for her charm. He had seen too much in his life to be intimidated by her high-powered tactics. He wasn't going to just give up his farm because some fancy suburbanites thought his tractor noise was too much. Every time Lydia tried to push him, Jim stood his ground. He refused to let them take his land, refused to let them erase his family's history. But what Jim didn't know was that Lydia wasn't just going to back down. Lydia had a secret weapon, her own plans to build a cultural center and shopping mall on land adjacent to Jim's property. She saw Jim's farm as standing in the way of her grand vision for the community. Lydia began to paint Jim as the villain, as the man standing in the way of progress, the one who didn't care about the future of the community. She'd convinced herself that she was doing what was best for everyone. Progress was always better than tradition, right? And so, with a corporate mindset, Lydia continued her assault. She started bringing in construction teams and landscapers, making small changes around the boundaries of Jim's property to provoke him. They were testing his resolve, seeing just how much they could get away with before he gave in. Every time Jim tried to push back, Lydia made it clear that she had resources. She had money, power, and she knew exactly how to use them. One afternoon, as Jim was preparing his land for the fall harvest, he noticed something strange. There were new surveying marks near his eastern boundary, the side of the farm where he grew his best corn. The surveying equipment wasn't on his property, but it was close, too close for comfort. He figured it was just the HOA making plans for landscaping again, something that had happened countless times before. But when Jim left the farm to visit his mother, it was clear that something far more sinister was at play. 3 weeks later, Jim returned home, only to be greeted by a sight that made his blood run cold. Heavy machinery had torn through his eastern field, destroying nearly an acre of his best crops. And there, cutting right through the land, was a train track, the kind of tourist attraction Lydia had talked about in her meetings. The train tracks weren't just some temporary installation, they were permanent. They had built a full tourist train that connected the HOA's newly established heritage center to their clubhouse, cutting through Jim's property as if it had no value at all. Jim was furious. The train tracks were not only an invasive project, they had destroyed his crops, his livelihood, and his heritage. And when he confronted Lydia about it, she casually dismissed his concerns. She told him that the train added character to the neighborhood and that it would increase everyone's property values by 15%. When Jim mentioned the destruction of his corn crops, Lydia waved it off and offered him a check for a few $100s, a sum that couldn't even cover the cost of his seeds, let alone the lost revenue. Jim's world felt like it was falling apart. Everything he had worked for, everything his family had built, was being trampled underfoot by an HOA that cared more about its aesthetic vision than his legacy. But Jim wasn't going to let them win. The next day, Jim called his lawyer, Sam, a no-nonsense man who had helped him with legal matters before. Sam confirmed what Jim had suspected. The HOA had falsified documents and misused county ordinances to justify their illegal train track construction. It was a common tactic with aggressive HOAs: exploit the legal system, knowing that the average person couldn't afford the legal battles that would follow. Sam explained that it would take months, maybe even years, to untangle this mess through the courts. The HOA had deep pockets, and they were counting on Jim not having the resources to fight back. Jim's heart sank. The legal system, Sam said, often favored those who had the most money, the wealthy, the powerful. As Jim stood in his barn that night, looking at the photos of the train tracks and thinking about how the red and white cars gleamed through a sweet cornfield, something inside him snapped. He couldn't just stand there, letting them destroy everything his family had worked for. He had to fight back, and not just with legal papers. Jim was about to make a move that would turn the tables once and for all. The night after Jim learned that the HOA had misused legal loopholes and falsified permits to build the train track through his property, he couldn't shake off the feeling of violation. Standing in the stillness of his barn, surrounded by his grandfather's old tools and records, Jim knew he couldn't just let the HOA get away with this. The legal system was stacked against him. Fighting them in court would be long, exhausting, and expensive. Time was running out, the crops were lost, the train had already run through his fields, and the Pine Ridge HOA was relentless. That's when Jim remembered something his grandfather had taught him years ago. Always keep your records in order. His grandfather had spent countless hours filing away documents, deeds, and maps, each one meticulously maintained. Jim's grandfather had been a fighter, too, someone who never let injustice slide by. If anyone had the knowledge to win this fight, it was Jim's grandfather. Jim spent hours digging through the old metal filing cabinets in the barn. His eyes scanned yellow deeds, survey maps, and handwritten notes from the 1940s. That's when he stumbled upon a file labeled Northeast Corner Dispute, 1968. It caught his attention immediately. Jim opened it, carefully flipping through the brittle pages. He felt the weight of history in his hands. As he pored over the documents, he found a detailed surveyor's map with notes written in his grandfather's own handwriting. What Jim discovered sent a rush of excitement and disbelief through him. The small parcel of land where the HOA had built its headquarters wasn't even part of their property. It belonged to Jim's farm. It was an error made during the initial development in the 1960s, a surveying mistake that had been ignored for decades. Jim couldn't believe it. The very office building where Lydia Caldwell and her team worked every day had been built on his land, and the HOA had never realized it. They had been operating illegally on his property for years. This discovery could change everything. But it wasn't enough to just have the papers. He needed to act, and fast. He immediately called Sam, his lawyer. As Jim sent over the documents, Sam's voice on the other end of the line was filled with excitement. "Jim, this is huge. You've got them right where you want them. This land, this office, they've been operating on your property without ever knowing it. We've got them." But there was a catch. Jim had to move quickly. A corrected survey would take time, and Jim knew that Lydia and her team wouldn't go down without a fight. He had leverage, but he had to play his cards carefully. With the knowledge that he now owned the land beneath the HOA's office, Jim sat back in his rocking chair one evening, his mind swirling with possibilities. What could he do with this information? What would his grandfather have done? Jim knew he could take the legal route, but that would drag on for months, perhaps years, and Lydia would use every tactic in the book to wear him down. Then an idea came to him, a bold move that would both stop the train project and bring a sense of justice to the situation. Jim decided that he wasn't just going to sue the HOA for trespassing. Instead, he would take a radical approach. He would donate their office building to a veterans charity that his grandfather had supported for years, Veterans Rebuilding America. Jim called Maria Jenkins, the director of the charity. She was shocked when he explained the idea, but after listening to the full story, Maria was on board. Jim knew that his grandfather would have been proud to see the farm become a beacon of hope for those who had served the country. This donation wouldn't just be about him. It would be about honoring his family's legacy and doing something good for the community. But Jim had to be discreet. He couldn't let the HOA know what he was planning. He would need Sam's legal expertise to ensure everything was legally sound. It would be risky, but Jim felt certain this was the way to fight back. It wasn't just about taking control. It was about showing the community that the fight wasn't about property values. It was about community values. The day Jim had been preparing for arrived. He knew he had to act fast before Lydia and the HOA could do anything else. Jim took the day off to make the final preparations. He contacted a local locksmith who had helped him in the past and arranged for a sheriff's deputy to accompany him. With the paperwork in hand, Jim headed to the HOA office early in the morning. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, Jim stood in front of the HOA office, now officially his property. He could already see the train tracks running behind the building, a symbol of the corporate overreach that had taken over the community. Jim could feel his heartbeat quicken as he walked toward the front door. The deputy arrived just as Jim's locksmith went to work, changing the locks and securing the office building. By 8 a.m., Maria Jenkins and her team of volunteers, all veterans, arrived at the building. They started putting up signs that read, "Future Home of Veterans Rebuilding America," along with American flags. The atmosphere shifted from one of tension to one of purpose and hope. This was Jim's way of giving back to the community, a community that had long been overshadowed by the HOA's power. As Jim watched the veterans begin their work, he felt a sense of calm. The war he'd been fighting wasn't just about reclaiming land. It was about creating something better out of the mess the HOA had made. It was about showing that even in the face of adversity, there was room for hope, growth, and change. To by 9 a.m., the local newspaper had caught wind of the donation, and a reporter was already on the scene. Word quickly spread through the neighborhood, and by the time Lydia Caldwell arrived at the office, she was met with a crowd of curious neighbors and veterans who had come to help. Her luxury SUV pulled up, and Lydia's expression was one of pure disbelief. She got out of the car, stormed toward the entrance, and tried to use her key card, but it wouldn't work. Jim stood outside with Maria and the veterans, waiting for Lydia's reaction. When Lydia realized the office was no longer hers, she marched over to Jim, her heels clicking furiously on the pavement. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice cracking under the pressure. Jim calmly handed her the legal documents proving his ownership of the office. "Actually, Lydia," he said, "this property has always belonged to my family. I've simply decided to donate it to a worthy cause." Lydia's face drained of color as the sheriff's deputy stepped forward to confirm the documents. Jim could see the worry and fear in her eyes as she scanned the paperwork, knowing that her fraudulent permits for the train track were about to be exposed. As Lydia tried to keep her composure, Richard Thompson, her lawyer, arrived, his face full of concern. He quickly began reviewing the documents, and Jim couldn't resist adding, "Maybe next time, you'll think twice before building a train track across someone else's property." The next few days were a whirlwind of media attention and community support. The local news station aired the story of the farmer versus HOA battle, featuring interviews with Jim, Maria, and several Pine Ridge residents. Many of the neighbors, who had been silent until now, came forward to show their support for Jim's actions and the veterans' charity. The HOA, led by Ellen, the new interim president, was forced to dismantle the train tracks, restore the property to its original state, and compensate Jim for the damage done to his crops. The neighborhood was now buzzing with excitement about the veterans' new headquarters and the community garden project that Jim had proposed. The HOA, now under new leadership, agreed to revise their bylaws, ensuring greater transparency and community involvement. Monthly dues were reduced, and the focus shifted away from cosmetic improvements to actual community needs. Ellen even asked Jim to join the HOA's Community Relations Committee, a position where Jim could ensure that community values always came first. Jim stood on his porch, watching the train tracks being taken down, and felt a sense of relief he hadn't felt in years. The farm that had been under siege was now thriving, and for the first time, Jim felt like he could breathe freely. Sometimes, fighting back doesn't just protect what you have. It creates something better in its place.